Thank you, Zay. I know that this is being taped, so I will be very sure not to call anybody a monster during this next 25 minutes, and I'm told that if I should, that they will edit it out for me, unlike the Scottish newspaper. So I'm gonna just say something about, broadly about ideology. Psychologists did speak a lot about ideology. The psychologists who came in the post-World War years from Europe to the United States were deeply interested in the question of authoritarianism, and there are hundreds and hundreds of studies that were done to develop something called the F scale, the fascism scale. And this is work that just died for many reasons having to do with the nature of the work itself. It had its set of problems and so on, but really because we believed for about 40 years or so that there was nothing interesting going on in the human mind, we gave up entirely looking at these kinds of rich mental constructs like ideology. And so it's really wonderful to see people like John and John Jost and several people in this room revive this concept and begin to actually name it and to speak about it. So what I'm going to do is just give you a few pieces of evidence, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion with my colleagues from the law school, in part because I think we've been fairly focused on what the nitty-gritty of the evidence is. So we'll say, look, there is a relationship between X and Y, and I think we come to what we see as a precipice and know not what to do about where it can go. And so I'm hoping that because we tend to come largely from one part of psychology, the part of psychology that believes that human beings are basically flawed, that they make errors in judgments and decisions up and down, that they do this without awareness, and that these decisions have moral consequences. So we go about that far. And then I think that the reason that John Hansen is playing such a pivotal role in setting not only a conference like this up, but having a blog like The Situationist and so on, is to begin to see if any of this work can do anything real for us. And so I very much look forward to your responses to this sort of work about whether it is we're being too starry-eyed about what the work can actually do, and whether we're not pushing it enough. So that would be sort of my plea. I titled this very simply The Hammer of Ideology because even though I don't study ideology per se, we've been finding pockets of evidence up and down that seem to indicate that it connects up to all sorts of things that I personally had never believed it might predict. So let me just begin by saying that there is something about the power of a single item, a single question that can be posed, that is impressive, and it should be especially impressive to people like me who have spent a career talking about why survey questions aren't very worthwhile. So for somebody like me to not only show that a survey question can do a lot, but that a single survey question can do a lot of predictive work is actually quite humbling. I'll give you one example, not related to ideology. This is a brilliant example of a single question that taught us a lot. Walter Mischel posed to little children the question of, would you rather eat this one cookie now or wait and have 2 cookies later? Or, have no cookie now and get multiple cookies later. That was the simple question, and the answer, 1 cookie now versus 2 cookies later, ends up predicting years later all sorts of things about that child in terms of that delay of gratification at that early age ends up predicting many things about that person in older age. And we don't have too many examples like that of a single item being that kind of powerful indicator, but I'm going to say that we have one here again, and it's the simple single question of whether you're conservative or liberal. Okay? That single question seems to be doing a fair amount of work, and I'm not going to simplify because there are people who'll speak later today who've constructed scales that measure all sorts of very complicated constructs, so but I do want to put this up and tell you at least a little bit about what I think we know it does predict. First of all, that 3/4 of the people who are given such a question can actually place themselves somewhere on it. Okay? And second, that it accounts for a whopping 85% of the variance in candidate preferences across many elections. Okay? So we know that it does at least that. But you might say, well, that's sort of almost tantamount to saying that's what you're measuring. They're the same thing. To ask whether you're liberal or conservative should predict whether you vote for somebody who's liberal or conservative. So let's begin with that. But I'm going to just say whether it's anything important or trivial, this particular question predicts all sorts of things about whether we favor guns or not, God or not, guacamole or not. What are the two main concepts? I'm going to argue that if you look at something like ideology, and here I'm just borrowing from John Jost's work and the work of his colleagues, Aryeh Kruglansky, Jack Glazer, Brian Nosek, others like them, who have shown that basically we can reduce this notion of the left-right distinction to two main concepts, okay? That people who tend to be on the liberal end of things, and I'll say liberal rather than left because that is another issue of contention that has come up, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second, that that liberals in the United States prefer systems that are flatter. They prefer systems that are less hierarchical, okay? Versus those who are conservative who prefer systems that are pointy. And the person who's done the richest work on sort of this idea of social dominance is in the room, Jim Sedanius, and you'll hear from him later today. So I'm going to say very little about it. The second dimension on which liberals and conservatives appear to be different is this dimension of preferring change versus preferring tradition. And this has been, in some ways, more controversial than the first. I think conservatives are willing openly to say that, yes, they prefer systems in which some people lead and others follow. So they might actually consciously express that particular value. What they're much less willing to necessarily agree with, and this is what got John and his colleagues in a lot of trouble with people like Bill O'Reilly and Rush Limbaugh and so on when their paper appeared, arguing that people who are conservative seem to show on these empirical measures a lack of tolerance for ambiguity, that there are people who prefer certainty of a certain kind, and that when things like 9/11 happen, you see this move towards that kind of embracing of a stable world in which there is a leader to whom one listens and so on. So this has been actually challenged because not everybody on the right agrees that people who are that way have anything like a stronger need for certainty, for example. But those are the two main dimensions along which we're going to be speaking about. So back to, again, where I have been, which is in this world of work on something that we call implicit social cognition, the idea being that there are things in our heads that we have no clue about. That's how we are, that's how we've evolved, that's the way in which the brain sucks the culture up and does things with it, but without conscious awareness. And I'll just say that in one sentence, and I'll use the term implicit social cognition to refer to all of the stuff that lies sort of below the surface and say very little else about it. There's been a signature result from this work that we have touted over and over again, and we've said, look at the dissociation between two kinds of things. And when we speak about this, we tend to focus on people who are liberal, largely, okay? You express conscious attitudes, explicit attitudes that are favorable towards disadvantaged groups, whether it is women, whether it is people of color, whether it is people who are gay, the poor. But when we look at the behavior of those same individuals on measures that are less conscious, that are more implicit in form, what we find is much greater evidence that that same mind that's expressing low levels of bias, low levels of prejudice, in fact positivity towards a disadvantage, are actually showing that. And it's that split, that difference between what we see on the conscious reported measure versus what we see on the implicit sets of measures that has been intriguing to us, and we call this a dissociation because it represents a kind of a fracture in the way in which our mental systems are set up, because these are not ones we seem to be aware of. Okay? So that's the result we've focused on, and I think to the neglect of something else that I'm going to now tell you about that may, on the surface, almost seem oppositional to what I've just said. Instead of showing that, yes, these systems sit in separation from each other, we'll now look at correlational data to see if the two actually are combined as well.